Good evening, and thank you for tuning in and joining in with us tonight. We are picking up our study here in the book of Philippians, in Philippians Chapter 3 tonight. So far, we've talked about the intro to Philippians Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, and tonight we find ourselves in Chapter 3. Joining me as always for this study and back and forth is Michael Ray. Michael, how's everything in beautiful Somerset tonight?
Good evening, my friend. Everything is well. Chapter 3 is a lot like one of our studies because he's right in the middle of the book and he starts it with finally. And so I think that has a lot in common with what we've done because we say finally and then we're halfway through.
That happens more often than I like to admit. Also, thank you.
Finally is when a good preacher is getting his second wind. That's how you know that's when he says finally.
You start to get the real spirit going through you and can talk through. Also, those of you that have reached out and they're watching this again and have either text or called or sent messages, we appreciate it. We were pretty convinced that only our mothers were watching this, so it's good to know that there's more people out here listening to this study along with us, and we appreciate that. We'll keep doing it as long as we can get some value out of it, and hopefully you can get some value too. So, Michael, as we get into Chapter 3, what's the first thing that kind of jumps out to you here with what's going on in this letter?
Well, I would say first, if you're talking about Chapter 3, the whole kind of overview of the chapter is, the first verse I think is important, is finally rejoice. And I write this again because I want to say this again, and it's a safeguard for you, depending on what version you're, it's a safeguard for you, rejoice. So the kind of the overlay of everything he's going to say here is the optimal, the correct Christian state is rejoicing. Mm-hmm. And then he kind of gets into some things that might detract from that. But the natural resting state of a Christian should be that verse 1, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice, and we kind of know that phrase. So I would start there, at least in my mind, making sure that we got that frame of mind. And remember, Paul's in quarantine here, right? We've said that before, and that word probably means more to us than it did a month ago. But Paul's in quarantine. He's got this rejoicing attitude. I think that's significant.
Yeah, and especially so to something else that you said there that's significant here. Rejoice, but then he's going to talk about some difficult things, right, throughout the rest of this, and some things that generally you and I probably wouldn't say, these are things we rejoice about. These are things that, just the best. But I think that's significant too, because the idea of rejoicing, the idea of joy from his statement in context here is that it's a choice, right? This is a choice and a state of mind. It is not circumstantial driven. And for too many people, I think that's the struggle, right? Is that our joy is circumstantial rather than what we choose for it to be.
Yes. Happiness is temporary and joy is permanent, right? So that there's a difference. Happiness is circumstantial and joy is situational of the heart. And so, yeah, I definitely agree with that comment. I think from a broader point, I somewhat understand Chapter 2 is we're going to rejoice, and here are some things to avoid. These are joy thieves. That's a John Calipari quote, right? Nobody's going to steal my joy. He's pretty good at saying that. So, as a Christian, what's going to steal our joy? I think he starts getting into some of those things. And so the first one, and I'll kind of lead off here in the conversation, because I found I got just stuck in verse 2 in my thoughts. I just found it so interesting, and I'll read it. And again, I'm in New English translation. That's the soup du jour for me for whatever reason. But the New English translation says, "Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh." And I think you read most commentaries and smart guys and I certainly agree with this and make sense in the context. There are some people who are coming to Philippians and trying to teach some Judaizing ideas, right? Some got to keep the old law kind of ideas. And so it at least it appears to me, and I get your feedback on this, it appears to me that in verse 2, when he says, beware of those who mutilate the flesh, he is talking about those who would hold to circumcision.
Yeah.
And so the thought that rings with me and that gives me some pause, and I think is worthy of some conversation, is how do you get to a place in your religious life where something that is God designed as holy, such as circumcision, and something that is clearly not wrong in and of itself. Paul had Timothy circumcised. We could rehash all that from the book of Acts and other places. But how do you take something that God made as a holy sign of a covenant relationship and treat it in such a way that Paul refers to it as these people are just mutilating the flesh? There's a word for that, right? There's a word for treating something that's holy as common, which is it's profanity.
Right.
So this is
blasphemy.
Yeah. So there is an element of profanity and blasphemy there in verse 2 that just struck me, that they've taken this holy covenant sign, and Paul says these guys are just mutilating their flesh. And so what's the parallel? And then what examples do we draw out of that?
Right. So without, I don't want to get too off the rails here, because I think that's a very important discussion, and I want to have that and not eat up all of our time with backstory. But I think this is always really, really important. When you get into circumcision, works of the flesh, stuff like that, I think it's very important for us to just take a couple of quick seconds, minutes, whatever, and define terms here. So what these Judaizing teachers are doing is saying, essentially, in order to become a Christian or a real Christian or a devoted Christian, you've got to become a Jew first. You've got to essentially be proselytized before you can become a Christian, right?
Yes.
You can't really go from Gentile to Christian. You've got to become a Jew along the way. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it's not just circumcision. Like, circumcision is just a calling card for this, but it's also adapting a lot of other customs that they were trying to bring in here. So yeah. I think there's a lot there, and there's a lot to unpack there. And I don't necessarily, like I said, I don't want to take our entire class just unpacking that, but it's significant for us to understand that, the circumcision is of course an outward sign, right? It's the physical manifestation that you're a Jew. If there's, no other way, you didn't wear a badge that said, hi, I'm Michael, I'm a Jew. You were circumcised, and that's what meant that you were a Jew. Well, Greeks, Gentiles, obviously weren't a part of those customs, right? They weren't circumcised and followed different paths. So I find it so interesting that from our backstory here about what Philippi is, remember, Philippi is little Rome. It's all Gentiles. There's no synagogue here. So there's no synagogue here, meaning that there's not 10 Jewish men in the city, right?
Correct.
Am I right?
By the way, that reference goes back to Acts 16. Remember, Paul, his custom was, you go to Thessalonica, you go to Berea, you go to Athens, you go to Corinth. He's always going to the synagogue. He doesn't in Philippi. He goes to the where there was likely to be a place of prayer, that's where he finds Lydia. So that's where you're getting your reference. So apparently there weren't enough Jews, weren't enough worshiping Jews here to have a synagogue. Leads to your point here. When he says in verse 3, we are the circumcision, that is we do not get the irony of that.
Yes. Yeah. And further, like, one of the things that's very interesting about this is that, again, you don't have enough, the old joke, like, you don't have enough people to start a fight. Like, there's not enough Jews here for a synagogue, yet at the establishment of this group, of this church, of this family of God here in Philippi, now these clowns come from all over the world to come and set them right? That we're going to teach you good and make sure that we thoroughly proselytize you so that you can be real Christians, which I think is fascinating that they took that kind of effort and energy to come and bring problems that didn't exist to this church.
Yes. And so that point's well taken. And so I think that feeds into the larger point here of there's definitely some things that are being brought in by these people. And again, it just strikes me as significant that Paul says that what they're doing is this is mutilation of the flesh. This no longer has any spiritual value of any sort, not even to Jews. And I would think even at this point in history that circumcision to Jews who had become Christians still had some religious and spiritual connotations that in my judgment were important.
At least it did to them, right?
Correct.
I mean, they thought it was worth fighting for.
On a personal level, yes. But Paul says here, I mean, they have completely stripped all of the meaning out of their religion to the point where this is just mutilation, and that feeds me down to in verse 7 of this chapter 3, and I love the New English. Like, this is like the CPA translation of this of this verse. It makes me so happy. Is, you know, he goes through his laundry list of his personal credentials. Right? He's a Hebrew of Hebrews, Pharisee, circumcised the 8th day, all that stuff that you can read in those verses. But in verse 7, he says, "These assets," this is New English translation, "these assets I have come to regard as liabilities because of Christ." And so, anyway, that you talk about, I mean, just speaking my language here, right? Just keep it coming. But the what should have been an asset, the covenant, the relationship that came through circumcision, what should have been an asset became a liability. And how does that happen?
Right. Yeah. For those of you following along at home, if we can find a translation that says instead of assets and liabilities, use debits and credits, he'll cry on the street.
I will move to that translation so fast it'll make your head spin.
But I think that's so significant. And here's where I'm going to go and probably get us in trouble, because, like, to me, that can happen today. Like when we take something and drive it into the ground in a stand for the truth moment, and that's usually the words or the phraseology that we'll use today, that I'm going to make a stand for the truth on XYZ doctrine, that we can strip away the intent of the doctrine. Because let's go back and remember, what was the intent of the circumcision? Like, and remember, Paul makes this argument in Romans 2. Abraham was justified based on his faith, and then God gave him circumcision as a sign of a faith, of a covenant that already existed, right? And they're saying, no, the covenant is the circumcision. He said, no. Covenant, the circumcision is a sign of the covenant. You've misplaced the intent. God is saying, Abraham, you're mine because of your faith. You belong to me based on your faith. And I'm going to give you this sign so everybody else knows about it. Okay. So, and I think we see this in the book of Revelation too, right? Remember the first 3 chapters of the book of Revelation, you've got these letters being written to the churches, and it's, you know, he who has an ear, let him hear. You have done this, but I have this against you, right? We kind of, if you think about the language there. But one of the things, and I believe it's the church at Ephesus, that's always been significant to me, is that they were commended for their stand for the truth. They were commended for throwing out the false teachers. But what's the rub against them? He says, but you've left your first love. So what many churches today would be so proud of, that we have stood for the truth. We will not have any error taught. But he says, no, I'm throwing you out. You have no place with me because you forgot why we were doing this. The only reason we stand for truth is because we love lost souls. But if you're standing for the truth to stand for the truth without the intent of it, like, what are you doing here? I mean, if you're trying to be an obstacle to somebody coming to Christ, which essentially is what these Judaizing teachers are, we're going to make it more difficult for you to come to Christ. We're going to try to put a law on you that nobody can keep in order for you to have grace that frees you from the law. Like, when we say it like that, it sounds ridiculous, and it should. But for these Judaizing teachers, that mark, that sign, that outward showing became so much that they couldn't see intent or anything else behind it. And that's why I think it became mutilation of the flesh.
Yes. And so, I think we're definitely simpatico here. When do our assets become liabilities? When does our background, or the parts of our faith that are important to us and that we hold to as very valuable? When does our stranglehold on those things take away our vision for the things that are truly important, the things that should be assets, the things that should cause me to be more helpful to my brother, in fact, cause me to drive a wedge between him and me, the things that should be assets become liabilities. That I am so struck by that. I can so concretely point to places where I've done that, where what should have been an asset ended up being a liability because of the faith that I put in it instead of in Jesus.
Right. And I mean, we could throw out a list of things there, you know, phraseology sometimes that we use. I was raised in the church. Like, well, great. Like you and I both aim to raise our families in the church. But if that's used at like, well, I was raised in the church, so I'm a better Christian than you, that's a problem, right? If you know, I was raised in the church, so therefore I was baptized at 12, 13, 14, 15, and here you are at 35 coming, so I've already been a Christian for 20 years and you're just now getting around. It's those types of things, I think. And probably there's a laundry list of these things we can name, but I think it's when you're holding on to something that you know should be valuable, should allow you to, you know, instead of you being better than somebody else or being a better Christian or whatever because you were raised in the church, it should be more, you know, let me show you around. I've been here for a while. Let me put my arm around you and show you around. That's the asset. The liability is when it makes me a jerk.
Yes. Or, you know, and in Paul's case, his specific, you know, if you go on from that verse, he says, I have regarded all things as liabilities except for Jesus. Mm-hmm. I have come to accept that anything I have in my mind, in my life, I've got the capacity to cause anything to become something that can get in my way. Good stuff and bad stuff. I've got the capacity to let that get in my way.
But and there's two things that I have a hard time getting away from in these verses. One is the fact that Paul's essentially saying, if you want to talk about a resume, I've got a resume, right? You want credentials, I got credentials, all right? If you boys want to try to go toe-to-toe with me on this, you will lose. However, all that stuff doesn't mean anything. Like, I've got the credentials, and they don't mean anything. And so the two things there are, one, the fact that Paul did and went through the work, and I think for anybody from a professional standpoint, if you have put in the work to get a bachelor's degree and an MBA or a master's or a doctorate degree, and you know what it takes to go down that road, what work it took, what sacrifice it took, what time it took, all of those things, those are, you know, things to, you know, in a certain degree to be, you know, to proud of, or, you know, to steal something from our last class, right? To be, you know, think good of yourself, right? Because you went through it. And so to think about, you know, what Paul's saying is he's got a doctorate degree in Jewish divinity. You know, he was, you know, a Pharisee of Pharisees. There is no greater than he is. He goes on in other places to say, guess what? I also had the Greek too. I was schooled by Gamaliel. I mean, he had a, you know, doctorate degree in divinity from Harvard alongside his advanced law degree. Like this guy had all kinds of credentials. So he's more than qualified to have the argument with you and can't be dismissed. But so that's one. But two, to be able to look at all that at that specific point in his life, all that those credentials would have meant to him, and to be able to now, on house arrest, in quarantine, say, you know what? That part of my life wasn't really what this was about. You know, these last several years where I've been bouncing from town to town, getting rocks thrown at me and being in prison and all that, that was better than my laundry list of credentials, which is his point, I think, in 1 Corinthians Chapter 1. To the world, this is foolishness. to any card-carrying member of the world, like, you're dumb, kid. Like, you gave up money, you gave up wealth, you gave up prestige, you gave up everything, and now you're on house arrest. Like, you have messed up in life. And he's saying, no, from my perspective, that stuff was rubbish, and that was leading me a place I didn't want to go. But now I have Jesus, and it's worth whatever I've traded for.
And how, it's kind of a personal question, but when I look at myself, what are things that should be assets that have the potential to keep me from knowing Jesus the way that I should know him? Because that's what he says, right? And he says that in verse 8. More than that, I regard all things as liabilities compared to the far greater knowledge of knowing Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so that, and I think we would agree that is includes, but consists of, but is not completely defined by reading what we can read about Jesus in Scripture. That has to do with, our prayer life and our study life and our worship life and our life with our giving with our brothers and our putting Jesus in action, that they can't fully know Jesus without all of those other aspects of our religious life. And so the things that should be assets, if they're keeping me from doing any of those things, they're keeping me from knowing Jesus, and they become liabilities. I probably hammered that too hard. It just really struck.
No, I agree. I mean, it's significant to think about. And, this really isn't, a place where either you or I talk about, professional credentials or any of that jazz. But I mean, I think about, some of the letters that you have after your name that I have after my name that, would you be willing to give them up? Right. Knowing what the work it was that cost them, for, if they got in your way, could you? If you had to be at that point where I've got to give this up, I've got to walk away from this because it's stopping me from embracing Jesus. And that's the thing. Jesus isn't Lord of my Sunday life. He's got to be Lord of all of it. So he's got to be Lord of the letters after my name too. Like, those all belong to him too. And I think that's significant.
Yeah, the answer to that question better be that we better, right? I mean, and we better be able to answer it pretty quickly. Is the far greater thing is to figure out how we can know Jesus better, mm-hmm. and to the extent that we figure out that those things, or whatever they are, they don't have to be professional things, right? They can be family things. They could be religious things. To whatever extent they're keeping me from knowing Jesus, they are a liability. They are a credit balance account.
now you it's why you don't put CPAs on calls.
Lost the crowd.
Everybody we were great, and then they're gone. So again, so those things are important, and to think about too. We're gonna have to move on, or we're never gonna get through the chapter without another hour and a half repeat of a couple of weeks ago. But the other important thing here is I think it's worth that personal hard look in the mirror that says, have I taken something good and debased it? Do I have a rallying cry that is if I asked you, and maybe here's a better way for this litmus test. If I asked you, how do you know you're a Christian? How do you know that? And if you've got to point to something, like it's because of my Jesus fish, it's because of my whatever, I think, it's the same way with these guys. It's because I'm circumcised. Like, that's how I know I belong to. Boys, it's not really it. It's bigger than that. It's broader than that. It's more significant than that. And if we're pointing to one thing that we have or that we do, or transversely, if we point to a bunch of things we don't do, I think you've got a problem defining things, right? What do we define by what it's not? Right? If I ask you, Michael, what kind of car do you drive? And you say, well, it's not a truck, it's not a minivan, it's not a go-kart. And you go on to all these things that it's not. At some point, you've never told me what it is. And I think sometimes people do that. Well, I'm a Christian because, I don't cuss, I don't drink, I don't smoke. Like, no, you're just telling me stuff you don't do. Like, how do you know you belong to Jesus? And if you can't answer that question, again, pretty quickly and fairly definitively, then maybe you've put your stake in the wrong place.
I think about what Paul said in Corinthians, where he said, test yourself whether you're in the faith. That I'm persuaded that when he asked that question, he wasn't asking about something that they had done in their past, right? So whether we are knowing Jesus, whether we are in Jesus, is not a question that can be answered based on a past act, or let me rephrase, can't be solely based on a past act. So if I say, are you in Jesus? Say, well, let me give you my baptismal certificate. I'm persuaded that's not what he's asking, right? In Corinthians, he says, so test yourselves currently, test yourselves today, whether you're in the faith, not based on a history book, but tell me what your life is like now. And so I think that speaks a little bit to the same point.
Yeah. And, it's, again, I'm full of terrible analogies, as most of you know, but it's almost, in my world, is your CE up to date? Like, where are you at on your CE? Like, yes, you got a license multiple years ago, but where are you at today? Are you practicing? Are you still in the profession? Are you doing it? Like, where are you at?
Continuing education for the newbies. You better define terms there. And I that is it's too close to home, and I don't want to talk about it anymore.
Well, it's hard because I had to do 24 hours in the last 2 days to get caught up because mine's due at the end of the month.
I have no comment.
So as he kind of moves through this, and we've got the contrast between those Judaizing teachers, what they thought was important, how he turns it around to, that's not what's important. There's more here. There's another statement he makes as he goes on. Where does that pick up? Indeed, verse 8, indeed, I count everything as lost because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them, this is another one of my favorite words, as rubbish. It's a good British word. As rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith. And like 10 and 11 here are, I think this is part of this litmus test, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, I may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible, I may attain the resurrection from the dead. I mean, like that's what should be written on your wall, on your mirror, on your heart. Like, this is the battle cry, I think, for Christians. Like, is this what our life is? And my question then for you, Michael, is how do you get there? How do you develop this mindset that everything else is worthless? I've got to have Jesus, and I got to know him. I got to know the power of the resurrection. I've got to share in the sufferings. One of the questions we talked about last time that just keeps popping up. In a book that's full of joy, he talks a whole awful lot about suffering. But that truly, that this is the capstone here, that by any means possible, I may attain the resurrection of the dead. How do we get there?
So I'm going to answer a question with a question, and that is, and I think it backs up a couple of verses, and the ideas feed together as you would expect. But whose righteousness do you have? And I think that's kind of foundational to a lot of the things he talks about. If I have Michael's righteousness, or if you have Mike's righteousness, we are going to be continually frustrated because our righteousness is limited, right? I mean, it's flawed. So he's the Apostle Paul was pretty clear about this, that it wasn't a righteousness of his own. And so if that is a pretty profound statement that I think helps me to understand a little bit about how did he get to that mindset of he was there's a Galatians 2:10 thing here, right? No longer I that live, but Christ that lives in me. He was so intent on his life being Christ's to work through him it wasn't his righteousness, and he could share in his sufferings and count all things rubbish and do all that because the part of him that wanted what Paul wanted was just dissolved. It wasn't his righteousness, it wasn't his life. To live as Christ, to die as gain. I think about what John said, and that he must increase and I must decrease. Paul lived that. Paul decreased and Jesus continually increased.
And one of the courses I went through. So every 2 years, I've got to have so many hours of continuing ed. And one of the classes you have to take every couple of years is on ethics. And I found this, especially getting ready for this, found this just fascinating, that one of the points in this ethics class was that all of us have a fundamentally biased view of our own ethics. Like if we don't use a separate standard away from us, we will by default justify every one of our actions, right? Because I make it right because I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't right. I don't think any of us say like, I'm going to do this and I know it's wrong. We've made it right in our own eyes and in our own view. So, I like that just hit me like a ton of bricks when I was thinking about Paul saying, this isn't my righteousness because my righteousness is terrible. Like I'm always righteous in my own eyes. So it's not my righteousness, but rather it's the righteousness of Jesus. It's his righteousness that I am, in essence, imbued with. When I become his, all my sins get wiped out. All who I am gets wiped out. And it's Jesus that covers all of that. So I don't have to worry about me being perfect. Jesus is perfect. And so as long as I can be in him, his perfection is what matters. And it doesn't matter about me. So I can then therefore let myself go. But I think the struggle that we have is we won't commit to being all in Jesus and won't let ourselves go. So then we're struggling with the part of me that I want to keep out that wants to keep his own righteousness instead of being able to get all of Jesus's righteousness. If that makes any sense.
Sure. And so I guess the follow-up question would be, if it doesn't depend on you and it is all Jesus, then how do you square that with your actions? I mean, if it's all Jesus, then your actions are no longer relevant, right? So how do you square that with personal accountability that's still necessary?
Well, I think that's part of the growth and development, right? That I'm not doing what Jesus wants me to do. I'm doing what I want to do because it is what Jesus wants to do. And I think that's our growth, right? That sometimes, and we go through this with our children, right? Like, you need to do this certain way. And they keep asking a bunch of questions about it. It's like, look, because I told you, just do it this way. And eventually you hope to build enough habits that they do things the right way on their own. And I think that's what it is as a Christian is, I don't not lie, cheat, and steal because like I'm afraid I'm going to get in trouble for it. I don't want to do those things because those aren't loving my neighbor as myself, because those aren't loving God with all my heart, soul, body, and mind. It's that my will and Jesus' will mesh together, and then I don't have to worry about those things. And I think that's exactly what Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5. Is it those works of the flesh in the beginning that if I'm about the flesh, I'm going to see those things manifest. But when I have the Spirit in me, when I've taken that on, and now it's the Spirit that dwells in me, these things just come out of my life. And I think that's significant, that you can't make an apple. You got to plant an apple tree, and an apple will come out of an apple tree. But sometimes we want to just like, I'm going to do peace. No, you can't. You have to have the Spirit, and then peace will come out of you. Love will come out of you. All of those things will manifest themselves out of us, but not until we make the transformation that we've got the Spirit dwelling in us and guiding us through those things. But remember how that begins a little bit before the end of chapter 5. You've got to put to death the old man. If I don't get rid of this old work of the flesh, I'm never going to have the Spirit. And so that's where it comes. So it's not that we don't have individual personal accountability. It's not that we've got a blank check. It's not the Romans chapter 6, shall I continue in sin that grace may abound. It's none of those things. It's a change of life that is none of self and all of thee, to steal the song lyrics.
And I would say that, why don't you want to lie and cheat and steal? It's because Jesus has worked in you, right? Mike used to want to do those things. I mean, what do I know? I mean, didn't get too personal there, but I mean, the old man had a desire for some of the fleshly things that go along with those things, right? And so why, and without any arrogance or without any boasting, say, well, why does the desire for those things less than it used to be? It's not because I've like personally willpowered myself through those temptations. It's because Jesus has changed me from the inside out, right? That those desires are different. And to your Galatians 5 analogy, those things are a lagging indicator, right? That they are, to use an economic term, they're an indicator of something that's already happened in the heart. Mm-hmm. And so lying, cheating, stealing are not leading indicators of that we're just not able to defeat our will. That's a heart problem. And if we so the accountability, I think, is about test yourself whether you're in the faith, to see that do I have the right indicator, are the fruits that are coming out of the consequences of my life such that there's proof that Jesus is working in me. So how do you get to the point of Philippians Chapter 3, to live as Christ, to die again? How do my aim to know him, to experience the power of his resurrection, all that stuff? Jesus has got to be working in us to get there. And to think that we're gonna willpower our way there is, first of all, it's arrogant. Second, it's not productive.
Yeah, it's asinine, and that's the struggle. And I think that's why many people fail in the Christian experience, is because they realize after trying to try harder, have more willpower, and just read it and do it, when they continually fail, it's, I can't do this on my own. And I think that's hard for a lot of us to admit. Like again, terrible analogies, but, self-help books are $1 billion industry. Like everybody's got a self-help book. Like you just read this book and you wish it, want it, do it, or you ask the universe or some other set of nonsense. But all of it boils down to is you've just got to try harder. You're just not trying hard enough. But the reason why it's $1 billion industry is because everybody that's looking for self-help still needs help. So they keep buying those products over and over again. But when we go to the scriptures, Jesus says it's okay that you can't do this alone because you're not supposed to. Like you need Jesus, you need the Holy Spirit, you need God the Father, you need all of those, and you need a church family, by the way.
Brethren, yeah.
There is a lot of tools you need in a toolkit. And I would argue that in a very simplistic way, Paul is telling you the roadmap here. It starts by to know him. That's your first objective you got to pass off. I've got to know him. Once I know him, then I've got to know the power of the resurrection. I've got to get those two things down. If I'll get those two things down, that'll give me the ability to share in his sufferings and be in the likeness of his death, that I might, by any means possible, attain the resurrection of the dead. I think it's Paul's way of simplistically walking you through the process of what it takes to become a disciple and then a Christian. That you become a learner, a student first, and then you develop to be Christ-like. But it is a process that we walk through. And I think this is Paul saying, here's the roadmap to get there. But until you start there, and I think a lot of people kind of want to skip ahead. Like I want to, be in the likeness of his death, or I want to try to skip to the end of this. I want to be a mature Christian already. When most of these things, to your point, comes back to a heart issue or a faith issue, that, I need to probably spend more time getting to know Jesus. If I'll spend more time there, that'll allow those seeds to grow in my heart and in my life and start to permeate me, that these other things will start to get better. But faith is always the number one part of this. And I think sometimes we write off faith as that's the 101 class. but faith is not a 101. Faith is a 101 and a 202 and a 507 and a 706. I mean, it's all the classes. Faith always grows, and you've got to be constantly re-upping and rededicating your life to
that. Well said. I might propose that, a great way to end this session would just that thought in verse 11, that by any means possible, or different versions render that different ways, but by any effort necessary, by any means possible, somehow that I may attain the resurrection of the dead. That persistence, that endurance, that I just get the vision of just a dog, on a bone, just not going to let it go. It is, again, he's decreased and Jesus is increased. That this is something that's such a fundamental focus and sole desire of his life, that by any means necessary, his assets are going to be liabilities. Everything is going to be put away for this one thing, that by any means necessary, he would attain the resurrection of the dead. And I pray that it would be that I would have the same attitude.
And one of the things I love that thought. And one of the things I always think about there too is the transverse of that also is true. Like Paul's saying, by any means necessary, but do we ask ourselves that question? What are we not willing to do to attain the resurrection of the dead? Because that fits too. Like, was it Meatloaf, the old song? I'd do anything for love, but I won't do that. I'd do anything for Jesus, but I'm like, there's a stopping point there. Jesus, I want to attain the resurrection of the dead, but not if it means losing my family, not if it means changing careers, not if it means giving up the house or the car or just fill in the blank. Like what is it in life that would stop you from attaining the resurrection of the dead? And that's got to be, that's that hard, me staring back in the mirror in the bathroom question of, what's that barrier? What's that obstacle? What's that one thing that I can't give up? Because that's at the end of the day, friends, that's where the rubber meets the road. If there's anything in that blank, then you can't have the resurrection of the dead. And that's what keeps me up at night is to thinking that there are friends, there are people that I care about, people that I love that have that one thing that they haven't let go of yet. And it's their barrier to a relationship with Jesus, or maybe a deeper relationship with Jesus, or that's what's stopping them. There's something there. And we got to be open. We got to be good enough friends. We got to be good enough family. We got to be good enough at these relationships to get to that point and for us to kind of talk through it. So great point, great place to end. Thank you all for tuning in. We got halfway through the chapter. We'll try our best next time to pick up with the rest of that. Maybe some more thoughts from chapter 3 before moving into chapter 4, but because there's a ton in chapter 4 as well. So
Sure.
We had to do this in 5 lessons, I don't think. If so, then we'll have to change that. But thank you again for tuning in. Appreciate you watching with us, studying with us, and hopefully we've helped you in your walk and in your faith. And if there's anything we can do for you, if you got questions or comments, hit us up in the comments below, and we'll do everything we can to help you along the way. Thank you for the thoughts tonight, Michael, and we'll catch you.
Enjoyed it, my friend. Enjoyed it.